The Watts Uprising of 1965 represented a crucial flashpoint in the tense racial relations that have come to define the decade. After the passage of the Voting Rights Act and protests in Selma earlier that year, expectations for change were high in the African American community. They were tired of the poll taxes, police abuses, and Jim Crow laws that upheld the system of racial segregation which had deprived them of basic human rights for so long. It was within this atmosphere of uncertainty and tension that a riot would erupt in the Watts neighborhood of South Central Los Angeles. On August 11th, 1965, the contentious arrest of a local black citizen by the Los Angeles police would trigger a wave of unrest unprecedented in scale and scope. It was a hot topic of news coverage both in the United States and worldwide, according to Lenson Gower, 2010. By the end of the 6 days of rioting, 34 people had died, 1,032 people were injured, 3,775 people had been arrested, and over $440 million worth of property damage had been done. These numbers may speak to the extent of the damage wrought, but it does nothing to examine the social causes of the uprising. It is worth investigating the underlying social tensions and motivations behind the unrest to gain some perspective on why those events transpired the way they did. According to Ingrid Ellen's The Dream Revisited, Contemporary Debates About Housing, Segregation, and Opportunity in the 21st Century, residential segregation is, quote, the separation or setting apart of people on the basis of race or income in places of residence in the United States. From the perspective of some sociologists and political philosophers, the separation of people spatially is one mechanism through which people are set apart socially, politically, and economically. It is a mechanism through which durable categories of inequality such as race are created and maintained. End quote. In other words, separating racial or ethnic groups into distinct residential areas can be one method by which the inequalities and injustices perpetuated to said groups are maintained. Yelena Bailey, in her book How the Streets Were Made, Housing Segregation and Black Life in America, contends that the process of residential segregation in the United States began in full force after the Civil War concluded and expanded over the course of the 20th century. In what came to be known as the Great Migration, many African Americans left the oppressive conditions of the South in search of further employment opportunities elsewhere. Many moved to the North or to the emergent West in California. By report of the U.S. Census Bureau, there was a significant movement of African Americans from the South to northeastern states from 1910 to 1940, then an even more significant migration from the South to the Northeast and the West Coast from 1940 to 1970. Several coercive factors created new segregated neighborhoods in the areas these African Americans settled down in. Restrictive covenants and local discriminatory housing laws barred many of them from attaining home ownership in certain codified white neighborhoods. The threat of lynchings, house bombings, and other terror tactics were used to keep African Americans in their prescribed living spaces. These segregated neighborhoods were often poverty-struck, with worse healthcare outcomes, worse public infrastructure such as schools and roads, and higher rates of crime and murder. Watts, located in south central Los Angeles, California, was one such neighborhood. According to Jeanette Abu-Lughad's book, Race, Space, and Riots in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Watts' African American population, alongside the poverty rate, grew, while job opportunities declined. Many of the African Americans who had migrated to California to find factory work during World War II were subsequently laid off and replaced with whites. The Harbor Freeway, also known as Interstate 110, served as a stark dividing line between the deteriorating Watts to the west and the economically better off areas to the east. Max Felker Cantor, in his book Policing Los Angeles, Race, Resistance, and the Rise of the LAPD, details the contentious relationship that the Los Angeles Police Department has always shared with its local communities of color. Under the leadership of Police Chief William Parker, the LAPD used excessive force and disproportionately monitored and targeted the African American community. They were obsessed with social control and viewed any dissent to that, such as protesting segregation, as a direct challenge to their authority. Policing was deeply racialized, with non-white communities put under far harsher scrutiny due to the stereotype that they are more susceptible to criminality. Parker put it as such, quote, "From a police point of view, racial categories are a useful fiction and should be used as long as they remain useful. The demand that police cease to consider race, color, and creed is an unrealistic demand." Unquote. There was a profound lack of accountability for the conduct of the LAPD and its individual officers. From January 1st, 1964 to July 31st, 1965, the police committed 64 cases of homicide. 62 of them were ruled justifiable. 27 of them involved the victim being shot in the back. 25 of the suspects were unarmed. 4 had not even committed a crime. If these were the numbers on the record, it is reasonable to assume there are far more cases never reported or documented, especially in an era before personal video cameras were commonplace. These punitive and explicitly racist policing policies were particularly infuriating to the residents of Watts, which was a heavily patrolled area. While the frustration with their living conditions and segregation provided a volatile gunpowder, it was one more instance of police harassment that would ultimately light the fuse. Abu Lughad's Race, Space, and Riots in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles provides a vivid account of the inciting incident and subsequent events of the Watts riot. On August 11th, 1965, by the corner of 116th Street and Avalon Boulevard, around 7 p.m., a police officer pulled over Marquette Fry and his brother Ronald. After Marquette failed a sobriety test, the officer requested backup to arrest him. An argument broke out between the Frys and the police. Marquette was struck in the face with a baton, Ronald was punched in the stomach, and both them and their mother were subsequently arrested. In the stifling heat, many people were sitting out on their porches that night and witnessed the arrest. A crowd of 25 to 50 soon encompassed over 1,000 angry spectators. Unrest spread quickly through the crowd, and when the police attempted to subdue it, it only inflamed the situation. Over the next 6 days, Watts was in absolute turmoil and chaos. Buildings were burned, storefronts were looted, random people were snatched out of their cars and assaulted, broken glass littered the sidewalks, and hails of gunfire and alarm sirens rang constantly. People took to their arms to protect themselves, their families, and their businesses. On day 3, the California National Guard were called in, and an 8 p.m. curfew was established. Blockades were set up by the guardsmen to try and prevent the further spread of violence throughout Los Angeles. There were mass arrests, and several people were shot for not complying with curfew or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The rioting concluded after 6 days, partially due to the oppressive show of force, and partially because so much had been destroyed that there was not much left to burn or loot. The McConaughey Commission was organized by the California state government to investigate and produce a report on the riot. It mostly deflected blame onto the population of Watts and made suggestions for improving infrastructure and reforming the LAPD that ultimately never came to pass. In his book, The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon provides a useful framework through which to view the violence that results from decolonialization. Fanon emphasizes the inevitability of violence when the colonized overthrow their oppressors, using the example of former African colonies. There is an intrinsic link between the struggles of African Americans and Native Africans in fighting racial discrimination. David Newsom's book, The Imperial Mantle, The United States Decolonialization and the Third World, relates the political activism of the two groups and the links that have bound them together historically. They mutually supported each other's struggles against white oppression and expressed a unified pride in their respective cultures. This makes Fanon's viewpoint more applicable to Watts than it may seem at face value. Fanon notes how oppressors will not ever truly listen to reason and will only yield to the use of force. The citizens of Watts' fury came from a sense that they were dejected and unheard. Years of suffering, segregation, and racist abusive policing went ignored until that anger bubbled to the surface and exploded. Years of peaceful protests and even legal victories in the civil rights movement did not translate to a better life for them. They felt there was no other choice. Tragically, the way history played out, it is clear their grievances were not listened to nor addressed. Nearly 30 years after the Watts uprising, Los Angeles would have another massive insurrection after the Rodney King beating. Culture Wars, an encyclopedia of issues, viewpoints, and voices, compares the two incidents and notes how the same economic conditions and police brutality that inflamed Watts were still just as wretched 3 decades later. Both incidents incited national debate over policing policies and economic inequality, which are still issues America struggles with to this very day. In summary, the degradation of residential segregation, compounded with the abuse of the LAPD, created a hostility in Watts that burst to the surface after the arrest of Marquette Frye. Their grievances were never meaningfully addressed, as evidenced by the LA riots of 1991, which gives credence to the Fanon framework that proposes that violence is inevitable when the oppressed attempt to break free of their oppression.